back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. In Michigan and across much of the country, Indigenous people vanish, and too often, their cases vanish with them. Behind each name is a person whose story is left incomplete, a community grieving, a family waiting. Yet when those families seek answers, they're frequently left with more questions. Tribal police, state cops, and federal agencies are often all involved to some degree. And this jurisdictional maze has allowed many cases to slip through the cracks. But change is stirring. Governor Gretchen Whitmer just proclaimed May 5th as Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Awareness Day to coincide with the National Day of Remembrance. It's a push for collaboration between state and tribal governments to address systemic failures. And Attorney General Dana Nessel recently announced the formation of the Missing or Murdered Indigenous People Task Force. It's bringing together tribal, federal, state, and local stakeholders. The Nottawaseppi Huron Band of the Potawatomi, a tribe based in southwestern Michigan, has been at the forefront of this kind of work through marches, advocacy, and community healing. The tribe has emerged as a leader in the fight for Indigenous visibility and justice. Robyn Elkins is the tribe's vice-chairperson. She joins us now. Vice Chair Elkins, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Robyn. I'm honored to be here.
Vice Chair Elkins, before we discuss the data, I want to begin by reflecting on something you said, and that is, we're all related, we're all connected. What does that mean to you in the context of missing and murdered Indigenous people, and how does it guide your leadership?
All of our Indigenous relatives, and we do refer to each other as relatives. Before colonization, we had our individual nations, as we do still today within what is now known as the United States. But so I am a tribal member with the Nottawaseppi Huron Band of the Potawatomi. I also have relatives with the Gun Lake tribe, and it extends out from there. So we are all relatives. All of our people are connected in some form or fashion, and especially when it comes to our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, or when we hear of a loss in one tribal community, that affects us all because we all have it in each of our communities.
The reverberations are felt among tribes, and I'm guessing that means across tribes, across Turtle Island, which others would know of as the U.S.
Absolutely.
Now, nationally, Native women face murder rates more than 10 times the national average. And in Michigan, there are roughly 4,000 open cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous people. Considering Native Americans make up about 2.5% of the state's population, this represents a deeply disproportionate impact. What do people outside of tribal communities often misunderstand about the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people?
Well, it comes from hundreds of years of, the Indigenous people. First, we were savages, and basically we weren't people by a lot of different standards. When you talk about the 4,000 cases that are recorded, we in our communities know that those numbers are probably much higher. One thing that we have faced over and over again is the underreporting. So either relatives have reported cases that goes nowhere, so then they're not inclined to keep reporting when they just keep getting pushed to the side by the agency in which they report to. Or they're unrecorded altogether. So, for instance, you can report a relative is missing, and historically, I do think that the agencies are trying to get better with this, but we still have a long ways to go. It was quite often, well, they they probably just went off and partied and got drunk and didn't come home, or they ran away. So there were so many different excuses how to just brush off our relatives, who then sometimes were never found again or seen again. And even when they were, again, the unrecorded cases lead us to believe that the 4,000 cases just within Michigan, those numbers are actually most likely much higher, because we hear about all the different cases that happen within our communities collectively.
So this is symptomatic of the deep marginalization that Native people have faced when it comes to the federal government and law enforcement agencies. I understand, too, though, that part of this has to do with a jurisdictional quagmire that the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people is wrapped up in. And what I mean by that is that tribes don't always have the authority to prosecute crimes on their own lands, while federal and state officials then often don't act. I saw this when I was doing a journalistic investigation into dozens of unsolved homicides of tribal members in Montana. It was so hard to get answers from the agencies involved, which again, it was tribal police, it was state law enforcement, and it was federal investigators.
Yes.
Talk about how this web of overlapping jurisdictions creates deadly gaps, if you would.
Well, if we're fortunate enough on our reservations to even have our own tribal police, and there are many tribal nations out there that aren't at that, they don't have that ability or the funds in which
Right.
to establish that to begin with. Again, it's a jurisdictional thing. If it happened on the reservation, or if it happened off the reservation, to a Native individual. And as a reminder, this can be women, children, men. It happens to all of our relatives. And that's why we refer missing and murdered Indigenous people or relatives a little bit more so than what it originally was referenced to as missing and murdered Indigenous women. So when there is an incident, the state, of course, can make the determination that that's outside of the tribal police's jurisdiction or their ability to actually go after and arrest somebody. And then the federal government, of course, they have a whole other set of what they can do. And honestly, sometimes it's because of the way tribal police can't always, they have authority up to a certain point.
Right.
And then the state and or the federal government, has an even greater authority. So if we have a case of a relative that has gone missing or has been murdered, in order to actually, when their perpetrator actually is being prosecuted, the federal guidelines might be the better way to go, just because they actually have more of an authority to prosecute that person. But the problem is that, so many times it can depend on if it happened on the reservation or off the reservation, and, who's going to take it from there. And, was it a Native person? Was the perpetrator Native or non-Native? And so there's just a lot of different things that come into play when it comes to tribal communities and how they decide the jurisdiction is going to go. And unfortunately, what that can lead to is a lot of times then these cases just kind of fall to the wayside because either, they're quick to tell tribal communities they can't do anything, but then nothing gets done much beyond that. And I can't say that's for every case, but that is still what goes on for most of the cases. And I can share stories. It's not in our community. I don't know if we want to get into that here. But, we do have a Michigan case where it was a young woman, and I don't want to say her name necessarily because I didn't contact the family to see if I could use her name on this. But she was a tribal member of one of our sister tribes north of where we are. She was stabbed to death in her own home on the reservation, and with her 2-year-old son right in the next room. her perpetrator was caught, and she was eventually sentenced. However, they kept the federal authorities kept pushing back the case. The prosecutors kept pushing it back and pushing it back. And the talk that was in our communities is they're going to let her get away with this. They know who she is, and they have the authority, but she's going to get away with it again. Just another person getting away with it again. And she was a non-native that stabbed our native relative in her sleep. And she did wind up being sentenced, but we actually did go to the steps of the courts in Detroit and protest. We want justice for our relative. Mm-hmm. And now whether that helped or not, it definitely didn't hurt. And fortunately, her perpetrator did wind up being sentenced, but that is one of the very, very few success stories in these cases. More often than not, like I said, they get pushed off or not even recorded.
Vice Chair Elkins, this tracks with some of the reporting that I've done when I was looking at cases and seeing people who would be charged, and repeatedly I saw those charges get dropped.
Yes.
And so then the path for justice, the path for closure feels non-existent. It feels so murky after that happens. We're talking about the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people. Our guest is Robyn Elkins. She's vice-chairperson of the Nottawaseppi Huron Band of the Potawatomi. That's a tribe located in southwestern Michigan. Now, your tribe has emerged as a powerful voice on this issue in Michigan. What compelled the tribe to take such an active public role, and how are you engaging other tribes and governments and communities?
Well, we did reach out to our sister tribes that are right here in Southwest Michigan. That would be the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, as well as Gun Lake tribe, otherwise known as Matchi-Benashiwash, to see if we would want to collectively be a presence on the National Day of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, to not only bring awareness to the fact that our relatives do go missing and are murdered, and also hopefully provide some healing for those that attend. So I don't know if you were able to join our march on May 5th, this last week.
Sadly, no. But I do want to hear about that, because it's not just a demonstration, right? It's a form of protest and of prayer.
Yes, we have. This was our fourth year, and I believe every year except for maybe the first, but maybe even the first, each of the tribes has their domestic violence victim advocates that work with our community members if there's domestic violence or if there's a situation that could lead to be possibly a murder. We don't know that. We try and keep that from happening as much as we can, but they're all there. And so if you've ever been a victim of domestic violence, or you have a relative that has gone missing or has been murdered, they're all there to help speak to our relatives. But we do this as an awareness component for all the communities to hopefully know about and see through things like this interview here, as well as different media sources. But we do a healing song. The gentleman did a drum song, and they sang for our missing and murdered, but they do a healing song. So, and then we had jingle dress dancers that danced after the march, and our Ogichida, so there are veterans. They actually protect the circle where our jingle dress dancers are dancing. There was a water ceremony done, which is another component of our culture that we do, and we pray for the healing, and we pray for this to stop against our relatives, and that there be action taking, and that our cases are recorded. So it's a day of healing. It's a day of prayer. We walk about a 1 mile walk around the city, downtown Grand Rapids, and people ask, what is that? We're like, hashtag it, Google it, ask questions, come down to the park. We're here, we can talk. So it's actually a phenomenal day, and very proud that we're on our 4th year having done this.
Vice Chair Elkins, for listeners who aren't Indigenous and, let's say, aren't able to show up to that march, what are other ways that they can be allies? What does that look like when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous people?
Ask questions, educate yourself. Whenever you see that there's any possible legislation, reach out and, ask your legislators to pursue this, to make these things right for our people, and which it does affect all of our communities, whether you're Indigenous or not. But educating yourself, being aware, and because there's so many people that don't even know about these statistics or that this is even happening hundreds of years later after colonists first arrived. There's so many people that want to honor, they, at a time we were considered savages, and now there's so many people that they love coming to our powwows that our different communities hold annually. They love seeing our culture, and this is another way that they can help protect our culture by supporting us in getting the word out about this. We call it in our community an epidemic of these unreported and unrecorded cases.
And with your work, it's becoming less of a silent one. Robyn Elkins is the vice chair of the Nottawaseppi Huron Band of the Potawatomi. That's a tribe located in southwestern Michigan. Vice Chair Elkins, thank you so much for sharing your time with us here on the Metro.
Oh, chi miigwech, which is big thanks in our language, Robyn, for having me, and I appreciate you bringing out this awareness even more. Miigwech.
Coming up, we'll talk with Michigan's Teacher of the Year. Stay with us here on the Metro. We'll be right back.